Okay, let's call a stored procedure from integration services. Now we're not just going to call a stored procedure and get a record set back. What we want to do is do all the bread and butter things we want to do. I've got a stored procedure called read customers, and it's going to read back all the customers in the customer table, but it's going to start with the one that we pass an ID for. So we've got an incoming parameter for the customer ID, and that's the customer it'll put first. So in this case we passed ID 4, so it put 4 first, and then it gave us the rest of the customers. And there's an output parameter. We want to be able to get that in our integration services, and that's going to give us back the customer name. And I printed that to the screen, so you can see here it gave me the customer name, and we've got a return value, and we want to get that in integration services too. And you can see that returns the customer ID. So that's the customer ID that we asked for. And of course there's a record set, which is all of these records. So we want to be able to pull all that out in integration services. So let's go to start here. Now of course what we would do is we would start with a data flow task, and we go in the data flow, and of course we're going to connect to an OLE DB, and you would think that you would select stored procedure as the access mode, but there is not a stored procedure access mode. There's basically just table and SQL command, and so we have to use SQL command, which means we have to call it pretty much the same way we called it from Query Analyzer. Just like we called it here in Query Analyzer, we need to call it here, except instead of using variables, we use these question marks to stand in for our parameters. Okay, fair enough. So we need to map those parameters. So we go here, which is unintuitive. You would think mapping the parameters would be over here because that's where you map columns and things like that. But no, you go over here. Now, one thing that's a little nice is it automatically sees that we have 3 question marks, so it gives us 3 parameters. Okay, but then it's up to us to fill all this in. In the parameters column, this is what you defined in the stored procedure. So this has to be exactly like we defined in the stored procedure here. We defined it like that. We defined that like that. So we have to, those have to be exactly, this is the code, the T-SQL side. And then this is our integration services package side. So this is our local variables. So, and then this is the direction. So we're passing this, so that's an input. And we're getting this back, so that's an output. And the return value is of course an output, and we're going to put that in a local variable called return value. Now one trick here, yet another trick, is for the return value, you have to use this. You notice we didn't define, you don't define a variable. Like, you don't define a variable in the stored procedure. In the stored procedure, you just say return, and you return the value. So this would be a value. You could have hard-coded a value, whatever, but we don't define a special variable for that, a special parameter for that. But IIS has one hard-coded in, and it's this. And it has to be exactly like that, including the uppercase and the underscore and the ampersand. It has to be exactly like that, or you'll get an error. Okay, so once you have these defined, you are now ready to go. And what we can do is let's take that out, and let's put a viewer here, and let's run. Okay, so here we got back, so 3, that must have been what we passed, right? So let's go, just quickly go back, look at those local variables here. Customer ID, see that initial value is 3, so that's what we passed to the stored procedure. So we get back the list of records, and we start with the one that we asked for, but we don't have the return value and we don't have the output parameter. So let's tack those on by using a derived column. So here's our derived column. So we're going to get the customer name and the return value, which got put into our local variables. So now we can turn this off, and let's put this down here just so we can use the data viewer. So this should now show us those values. So there's the return value and the customer name, but notice the customer name is blank and the return value is still set to our initial value. So guess what? You can't get it. You can't get those two kinds of values from an OLE DB source. For OLE DB source, you can only pass a value and you can get a record set back. So if that's all you need to do, then all you need is the OLE DB source. But if you need to get back an output variable, or you need to get that return variable, then you need to do a script task. So we come out to the control flow, and here's the script task which I've already written, but I've got it running last so that we don't actually get to see what it's doing. We need to now make it so that it runs first. So we'll reverse the arrow. So now it'll run first. So how do you configure it? Okay, again, you need to use the execute stored procedure, and you need to use the question marks. And instead of there being a button over here to configure the parameters, it's over here where you would expect it to be, parameter mapping. So here we've got our local variables, we've got the direction, and notice we now have a return value direction. It gets its special direction. We have to declare the data types. Now here we have something curiously called parameter name. So you would think we would have to do like we did before and put the names that we defined here inside the stored procedure. But you would be wrong. You don't do that anywhere here. Somehow it's able to pick them up just by the order. Here you put the order. So the return value was the first question mark, so it's 0, so this is 0 based. And the next one was the customer ID, so that's 1. The next one was the customer name, so that's 2. And this here, I just left this as default and it worked, so I'm not really sure what they want here. The defaults worked. And also, it didn't automatically give me these 3 based on my 3 question marks. I had to add each of these. So this works completely differently. Well, very differently. Okay, so now let's just go back to the data flow, and now we can actually see if that picked it up. And sure enough it did, so our return value is 3, which is supposed to be this, so that's 3, so this is 3. And the customer name is there, so we can see that's how you pick it up. Very, very kludgy that they're both so different and that there's no set way of doing a stored procedure. There was one other little kind of glitch that's kind of separate from this, but when I created that derived column for the customer name, the derived column, this length here, now the customer name in the table is a varchar 100. But what we have here is the variable, the local variable. So that so what it tries to do when it comes up with, it picks this type based on what this is, but it picks its length based on what's in it. And we had no default value, so it would have put a 0 here. So you could, and so then you would get an error. When you put the stream of data through this derived column, when it tried to load it, you would get a truncation error because it would be 0 length. Now, if we had a default value in it, let's say there was a 3-character default value in it, then the length would be 3. And as long as your incoming value only had 3 characters, you'd be fine. But as soon as you go over it, truncation error. So what we need to do is we need to set this to 100 so that it will equal the maximum value for that field that's in our table, in our database. Well, how do we do that? There's no option to do it here. You can click and click and click all you want. All you get to do is cut, copy, delete the entire row, it's going to automatically pick up on what's in this variable. And you can't define the length of the variable. When you go in the variable, all you get to do is say that it's a string, and you get the initial value. So what Microsoft has done is completely hidden it. What you have to do is right-click on the derived column control, and there is a Show Advanced Editor. And then you have to dig into the input and output parameters, and then you have to dig into the derived column, output columns, customer name, and then scroll down, and there's a length property here. Notice you could also change what type of string it is, like maybe it didn't pick up on exactly the type of string you need. So that's where you would change that, but there's the length. So this is where you need to put in that the correct length. So that's kind of an aside that really doesn't have anything to do with the fact that we're using stored procedure, but it is kind of a quirk I thought I'd point it out. If anybody knows of a better way to call a stored procedure from IIS, I'm all ears. Any questions or comments, leave them below. Thank you.